And climate vulnerability. So it's a project for which there will be a big need of R&D and scenarios. So that's why it's correlated with the theme of this week. And so Michel, it's 11:30, and you have 40 minutes of presentation, and then a few questions. Here you go.
Hello, everybody. I will go very fast, so you can take your taxi. Don't worry. And it's a non-scientific presentation I will do. There is a scientific basis on the project, and I will explain. But I am not a scientist. I am from the finance industry. And as I like to say, and Jean-Pascal is not there, but it is very unlikely that the finance industry is really aware of the problem we have with climate and energy. Very unlikely. I will talk about very pragmatic things in the finance industry, which is called risk, sovereign debt, very far from what we've been talking for 5 days. And I'm sorry. So sometimes you will think it's very bizarre and weird what I'm going to say, but the issue will be why there is no awareness of this issue for the finance industry. There are many reasons. And coming from this industry, my goal was to make much more awareness about the issue. I will talk about a kind of risk which is important in the finance industry, which is the sovereign debt risk. It was not at all important 10 years ago, for instance, and now it's at the top of the risk. I will talk about risk energy project, just to explain you what we're going to do. It's a work in progress, so sorry, it just started for the last 10 months, and it's a 3 years project, so we are just at the beginning. And I will talk a little bit about scenarios in risk energy, and scenarios, or what forecast means for mainstream industry, mainstream finance industry, and how they use it. So I will go as fast as possible at the beginning. As I mentioned, energy is not seen or is not taken into account by the finance industry. And for the climate, it's even worse. One of the reasons, as you know, this industry has been in huge trouble for the last 6 years, and it's still in trouble. There is no trust, no confidence, and the industry doesn't work very well. So always the same items, and Suzanne mentioned several items, and I will talk a lot about this item, which is the energy, the problem of energy scarcity. But if you speak in the way the people in the industry could speak, there are, as I said, market failures. So the market failure is the oil price, the carbon price, and the most important was the point mentioned by Reinhardt or Gael, the way the economists consider energy, and we use a lot of economists in the finance industry. So, you know the things. The price signal for oil was mistaken, hugely mistaken. It's very famous, this graph. I suppose you know it. It's the prediction, the forecast of the price of oil produced by the reference, which is the International Energy Agency, for the last 15 years. And you see the forecast and you see the real price. Well, it's well known. So the most important institution in the world which provide the price for oil has been producing this forecast in the last 15 years. Second point is that if you don't trust this kind of forecasts, you can look at the markets. What are the markets saying about the price of oil? It's well known now for several years that the market futures for the price of oil are disrupted. Even when it works, usually on the market, even when the market works, the price of the future price is quite the same as the price of today, anyhow. But for the last few years, it's even worse. Because of the shale oil boom, a lot of companies have been using this market to cover their position. So the future price of oil is very low these days. It's around $80, $85 5 years from now. So if you look at the market, it seems that the price of oil will decrease quite strongly in the near future. As Gaël mentioned, anyway, we don't know that much about the price of oil. It's very volatile. But what we can say is that the market future is disrupted. Even when you have forecasts, and this is the OECD forecast for the price. It was a study published last year on the price of oil. Even when you have forecasts, people don't care about this forecast. So this was a published paper where you see the price of oil here for the next 15 years was supposed to increase by 7% per year. And there is another paper, this is a study paper, this is a research paper by the OECD. There was other published paper by the OECD of an increase of 5% per year for the next 15 years. So this one more, I would say, pessimistic, and it was the variation that you'd consider. But I will maybe show you something of the IMF, which is a very famous forecast. The IMF last forecast was a stable price for the oil. For CO2, it was already shown 3 days ago. So there is no price signal at all for the carbon, so nobody cares now. And it's a huge problem for making investments and for the finance industry, how to take into account there will be a price on CO2 when you see that.
The European Parliament voted yesterday to increase that by removing some of the allowances of the market.
That's good news.
Voted that yesterday.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal, for your work. And it was said yesterday that maybe we are mistaken about the importance of energy when you talk about economy. And it's a key point for the RISC-AG project. Really, it's a way to talk about economy in a very different way, taking into account that the production function is not just work and capital, and the energy is certainly much more important than we think, or that mainstream economists think. I just present you studies done by the World Bank on the commodities, many commodities, and I suppose you know that the price of commodities has been falling down for the last century, and since the last 10 years, it has strongly increased. And when the World Bank looked at, and especially for the agricultural commodities, they explained that it's not only strongly correlated with the price of energy and oil. There is quite a direct mechanism to explain why the price of grain, of wheat, have been so high in the last 10 years. Because you need mechanization, you need insurance, and many things. And beside that, it has been the catastrophe of ethanol in the US. This is a graph I like. It's a worldwide industrial production in blue for the last, I think, it's the last 20 years. And in black, you have the world oil liquid production. So it's not correlated, but you can have a feeling that oil production, oil volume is important. But I'm no scientist, so I won't. In the finance industry, you have some hints that people are aware there are problems with the energy. A few years ago, if you remember, a country like Mexico was hedging against a decrease of the price of oil because they are exporting a lot of oil. And they've been doing that for several years. What's new, and I think it's the first time we've seen that, is a country like Morocco has been hedging against an increase of the price of oil because they are oil dependent. And they are in quite big troubles. So this is the background. We think we have a problem with climate, as everybody knows, and we think there is a problem with energy, especially with oil. And we think energy is much more important than we think. But most economists think. We wanted to put the, to have a finance industry much more aware of what's going on with all these questions. The finance industry main role in our society is to assess risk. That's what they are supposed to do. So the idea was to look at what kind of risk should we try to study that would be quite important for this finance industry, and to provide a new way to look at this risk. And the idea was to look at this, the biggest risk nowadays, which is sovereign debt. Not the appearance of risk, but the amount of risk which is taken on the sovereign debt. So sovereign debt, I can show you a graph. This is the total amount of different kind of debt of bonds in the world. So you have the industrial bonds, which is around 10,000 billions. I don't know if I said the right word in English, but 10,000 billions of dollars, which is quite low, as you can see. This is between 89 and today. And in red and green, you have the financial bonds, so it's bonds by banks. So it has been increasing quite dramatically, and it stopped. The increase stopped with the crisis a few years ago. And in red, you have the sovereign debt bonds, which is quite huge too. So you see, it's around 40,000 billion of dollars. So the biggest risk market bonds you have is either financials, banks mostly, or sovereign. The industrial bonds are quite lower, much lower. I provide you the maturity, the length maturity of this kind of debt for different countries. For some countries, it's quite low. For instance, Brazil is 4 years. India is around 10 years. United Kingdom is 15 years. So it was France, I would say it's quite high, maybe 8 or 10 years. When you are quite wealthy and your rating is good, it's much easier for you to issue bond for longer maturity.
Excuse me, how do you define the maturity?
You emit for a certain time. It's the time length of the bond.
So you have to pay it back by the end of...
Yeah, sure. So for some countries, it's much smaller because maybe there is less trust, you know. So this is a very big market. When you look at the biggest, there are two big markets. Since the crisis, everybody knows that looking at the financial industry risk is just looking at the country risk because of the too big to fail symptom, you know. So when banks go bankrupt, they are saved by the state. Even for corporate now, people have understood that you can't lend money to a corporate without looking at the country where it is. If you want to lend to a utility in Spain, you have to look at what's happening for the Spain risk. And as I said, a few years ago, there was no risk at all. It was risk-free to look at sovereign debt. Then there was this huge crisis in Europe and the default of Greece. And I suppose you've seen for the last year, emerging countries who were supposed to be very far from being risky are considered now very risky, as you know. And even the regulation by regulators of the finance industry, we were supposed to say that there was no risk on this kind of debt. They are changing their mind, especially since the Greece accident. So this is something which didn't exist, and then risk happened. At the same time, in the finance industry, because of the crisis, regulation came back. These markets have been usually deregulated for 25 years, and now we've discovered that it cannot go that way. It cannot go on. In Europe, we have created European Securities Market Authorities, which is dedicated to many markets, but especially dedicated to the credit rating agency. Credit rating agency like Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch are giving marks to all the countries, as they used to give marks to all the companies in the world. And the regulators, which is quite strict in Europe, it started a few years ago only, it's very recent. They are studying the market, and now you have to be registered, you are under control by this agency, and they are publishing for the last 5 years, or last 4 years, they've been publishing some comments, reports, and they say that on this kind of risk, sovereign debt, which is very important, as I mentioned, the methodology and the means are not enough. What triggered the Riskergy project, one of the key issues that triggered, is that, as you've seen in the AIA reports, there is a big problem, one of the key issues, which is called energy subsidy, which is quite worldwide, and in many countries, especially in emerging countries. The price of energy is subsidized by the government. And this has been seen by the EIA for, let's say, last 5 years. As soon as the price of oil increased, a certain number of countries were in trouble because the weight of the subsidy on the budgets. This is a graph where you can see the subsidy before tax or the subsidy after tax, because sometimes in this kind of study you consider that when you don't tax energy, it's a kind of subsidy. And it compares for a certain number of countries the spending by the government compared to, for instance, wealth spending or education. And in many countries, you spend more money subsidizing energy than, that's one point. And the other point is that it's unsustainable for a long time, After a certain period of time, because the country can be in deficit, it's very risky. We did, it's not scientist studies, so we did a very simple study for 38 countries. And we looked at between 2004 and 2012, what was the evolution of the rating by the rating agencies. So if you consider that the rating agency methodology is not that good, don't worry. But we looked at how the ratings were evolving during that period of time compared to one criteria, which is that very simple criteria, which is energy dependence ratio. Very simple. And what we've seen is when your independence ratio, your energy independence is good, the rating have been rather increasing. And when it's bad, the rating have been decreasing. So it's not very, it's very simple, but it indicates that the energy independence, for instance, is something important. Bye. So we launched this, the idea was to, as I mentioned, to look at the finance industry. How do they assess the risk of sovereign debt risk? As a matter of fact, they don't assess. They just rely on the rating agencies, most of the time, I can tell you. We looked at the rating agencies and we saw that they were not putting a lot of money or effort to develop their methodology. I can give you an example. For instance, Standard & Poor's or Moody's, the number of analysts is around 1,500 people working, doing analysis of risk and publishing reports with ratings.
For each agency?
Around, yes. Yes, globally it's 1,500 for Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and it's around 1,000 for Fitch. So it's around 4,000 people, for which most of the finance industries has outsourced its risk analysis. Not really, there are still risk analysts in the banks or in the insurance company, but it's true that our industry rely a lot on these 4,000 people. And for one agency like Standard & Poor's, the estimation is that 50 people among the 1,500, 50 people are working on sovereign debt, because most of them are working on corporate risks. And there are hundreds, thousands of corporates, which is one point. Of course, the other point is that you make money on corporate because the corporate pay you when you rate them. And they are not paid by the countries, most of the time. So it explains why their business model makes them with few people, few experts. Most of the experts come from the modeling, the economic modeling, or the macroeconomic modeling studies or academics. But it's very different, two different fields, between the sovereign debt analysis, which is macroeconomic modeling usually, or study or investigation, and people working on the corporate side, which are looking at balance sheets and looking at the different fields they have to, where they are experts. Yes?
Would there be an opportunity to create an agency evaluating the rating agency themselves?
Let's do it right now.
My point it's not the point here, but they are working in three different fields. They were sovereign debt, or something close to sovereign debt like local authorities. There was corporate, where their history is very long, and they have been working since the 90s on structured finance. On the structured finance, they participate in a way to the collapse of the financial world, as you know. And there are big investigations, for instance, by the US government against Standard & Poor's, which is the amount, I suppose the amount mentioned by the, there's a 100 report by the federal court, with one federal judge for the US government asking for $5 billion to Standard & Poor's, and it's not over yet. So on this field, really it was a big failure. On the corporate side, they have been criticized sometimes, as you know. Maybe sometimes they make mistakes, but they are quite good experts and they are forecasting risk for next 2 or 3 years, not that far. The point with sovereign debt, as I mentioned for the maturity, is sometimes you are supposed to look at risks for the next 5, 7, 10, or even longer times. And they were not, it was not a market for them. It was just a side effect of and they have been studying risk, but really it was not their point. And I suppose that's a reason I was wondering why they don't put much more effort doing that. It's, if they could, they would get out of this market, And they are pointed by the media, by the politicians, all the time they publish their new analysis about Italy or Spain or so on. So the idea was to try to develop a research program for 3 years, and there was 4 companies with expertise, 3 labs, and Caisse des Dépôts, which is a big French financial institution. And there were people here, and Gaël is at the head of the academic is monitoring the academic aspect of this project. So it's a 3-year project, and we are supposed to, it's R&D project, and we are supposed to have a real methodology at the end of the project. So it could be used if it works. Of course, it's real research. So I will go. I already mentioned that. So we want to develop, what are the new ideas is to use macroeconomic modeling to provide scenarios and to try to test things and to assess the risk for countries. And so, as I mentioned, we'll use energy as a factor of production, as a production factor. So there will be macroeconomic modeling, and we'll look forward for many years. will put an emphasis on energy. We want, it's a key point here, so it's very complex, but we really want it to be compatible with the regulation. So and the regulator is quite strict in the way it monitors the rating agencies. So it makes a lot of constraints for the R&D project, I will mention. So I just wanted to mention here what is usually done for risk assessment for sovereign debt. And it's done by all the big, what's called the big three is Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. They have 95% of the market. You know, it's a oligopoly, and they monitor everything. So what they do, and which is quite clever, they look at the economic performance. Usually it's GDP, how strong is the country. And then you look at the financial robustness, because what we want to see is if the state, the government revenues and expenditures, are you able to pay back the debt? Because it's just what we are not looking at country risk, we are looking at sovereign debt risk, which is a little bit different. It's linked, but we are looking at the way the government can, especially has revenues if the economy is well, but he has revenues if he is able to tax the companies and the individuals. And then you have to look at the debt, what is the structure of the debt, the existing debt, the maturity, and the currency. I mentioned the currency at the beginning, I forgot, but it's very important. There are certain countries which are obliged to have debt in foreign, well, not in foreign country, in dollar. There is just one currency. So either you have your own currency, and you can print money, as was mentioned by Gaël, and some country like England is able to print as much as pounds as he wants. And there are other fragile. The India is emitting most in rupees. I think 90% of the debt of India is in rupees. But you have other countries which are emitting in dollars. So the risk is much more important. And the last thing they look at, for instance, well, very important, which is, it's important for two, when you look at debt and sovereign debt, you look at the capacity to repay your debt, to avoid default. And you, of course, you look at the will of the people, or the power in place to pay, which is quite different. Sometimes you can pay, you don't want to pay. If you cannot pay, anyhow, you won't pay. But this is very important to look at, and it's very qualitative analysis of the institutions, institution, the public opinion, the syndicates, all can be screened, but it's not quantitative at all. So what the sovereign risk sensitivity is all this kind of different items I mentioned. What we are going to do, but it's just a project, so it's just started, is to have models for. We'll have a model per country, and as we want to publish as much analysis, we were working with the Paul's model, which was developed by Jean-Claude Kiki, and which is now Patrick Kiki, and which now is used by Enerdata and maintained by Enerdata, and there are around 45 different models for 45 countries. We'll be working here. There will be a work. There will be also Imaclim from CIRED, which is involved in the project. We'll have to change that and to put more economy for each country, and especially we want to model the state, the government state, with taxes, with the revenues, and with the debt, which is never done usually. And we have to have, with all these 45 models, we need to have a global model looking at the world economy. And especially, not only for that, but especially because one of the energy we will be looking at is global, which is oil. So we'll look at the solvency of each country. And I mentioned again, there will be quantitative analysis, of course, but it will be also qualitative work, because you can't put everything in numbers. This is the kind of criteria we will be looking at, which are links between energy and different huge item we want to look at, for instance, energy independence, which is very important. I won't go in details, but one of the problems we have, and I come back to the constraint, is we are supposed to work with data, with available data. And it is, well, the choice of parameter we're going to look at depends a lot on that, and as you can guess, for many countries. Well, for the OECD countries, usually you have data, but for many countries there are no data, so we won't put them in the models, or we just use them as qualitative input. I will go fast. So the project is ongoing. We are just developing right now the connection between the different 45 models. Well, we'll start with a few ones. And the layer we have to put above these models to take into account debt, sovereign debt, and then the macroeconomic for the world economy. And as I mentioned, we've started to work on the scenarios. That's why I'm talking here. So I'll go back on the big three rating agency methodologies. How do they work right now? As a matter of fact, they use a little bit forecast. Not that much, but there is a little bit forecast. What are the regulation guidelines? So the European Authority for Rating Agencies, what do they say and what are our constraints? And what we've done. So if you look at, for instance, Standard & Poor's or Moody's, they are looking at the situation today, what's happening in Italy or in France. They look at our financial situation, the debt, and so on. And they look at a kind of forecast. Usually it's to the year, well, this year, next, and maybe the one after. They are mostly looking at 1 or 2 years forward. And in their methodology, you can find it's public. This industry is very transparent. So now you can have a lot of information and methodology for ratings. They don't use their own scenarios. They use scenarios coming from financial institutions. The most famous is the IMF, or the World Bank, or the OECD. And this is the three I know. Sometimes they have their own expertise, but most of the time they use these kind of scenarios that you know, which are published every 3 months or 6 months. And they agree sometimes to use national scenarios. If France wants to provide a scenario for the rating agency, it will be used by it, if it's a good one, interesting one. When you look at the scenarios, for instance, IMF, but it's true of the other one, suppose that most of you have already done that, but you will see that the scenarios, the economic scenarios, the world economic outlook or things like that for this institution, they look at oil all the time. So energy has been considered as a key point for the scenarios. And when you look at where do the information on oil come from, most of the time it comes from the IEA, most of the time, not always, but very often. And very often, you will see it comes from the market futures. And as I mentioned to you, market futures sometimes usually are flat price. The price 10 years from now is the price we have now. And these days is lower because of the disruption I've mentioned. So look with interest to this kind of forecast. This is IMF, I think. This is where the World Economic Outlook of the last autumn by the IMF. And you have several countries. If you want to have detailed country analysis, you can have it by the IMF or the World Bank sometimes. And you see there are projections for the next few years. And it's what you find in the scenarios used by the rating agencies. And as I mentioned, a little criticism I personally make on this kind of scenario. It's a French joke, but I think it's kind of LBT I mentioned. It's a not very scientific process. It's called in French, après la pluie, le beau temps. It means just that usually these scenarios are very optimistic, you know. And for the last 8 years now, they have been forecasting very good news for everybody. Last October, they realized they were really, really too optimistic, and they did their own criticism about their optimism. So you can see in the IMF scenario, they are providing what were the forecasts, and all the mistakes they made since the crisis. Because the biggest error have been done since the crisis. Usually,
what is the way to read these graphs?
it was supposed, it's the way they were forecasting a return to the trend before the crisis. And everybody is, well, in the economy it's very common that you think that we'll come back to the previous good old days, you know.
Okay.
And it's not the same. You know,
So 0 is a given growth.
yes, it's a given growth which was.
It's a given growth rate.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you are at -5, it means that the actual growth or degrowth rate
Compared to what it should be.
is 5 points lower, 5 percentage points lower to what it should be.
What it could have been if we had found the way to come back to the previous growth. So the regulation is just a framework with a lot of constraints, but you know this problem, which was already mentioned for last week: availability of data, the quality of data, and this is really a problem for economic forecasting. If you look at the data, the quality of the statistical data are sometimes very bizarre. But if you look at energy data, for instance, we have to be very. We have to keep in mind that the quality of data is a problem too sometimes. Traceability of data is very important because we want to be able to rerun. That's a key point compared to the previous discussion. If we develop this kind of methodology, we are supposed to be able to rerun exactly with the same result we did 5 years ago if there is an inquiry by the regulation, you know. And they are not kidding with that. So all the agencies are supposed to maintain now in their databases all the data, all the inputs they were using for the whole history of their ratings. The point is that our methodology when you are rating sovereign is that there are not that many sovereigns, as you remember. We are just 190 countries, so it's a very small sample. And so we won't do what's done usually with the corporate, where there are a lot of econometric and statistical analysis. And there are not that many country bankruptcy, to provide this kind of default. Yeah. Right? It's quite finished. So the methodology which will be different, but we need to be able to compare two countries using the same kind of data. As I mentioned, for many countries there is no data. For instance, we wanted to use in RISC-RG agricultural data, which is not possible, because for too many countries there is no agricultural data which are really of good quality. And the methodology must be robust. You are not supposed to change your model every year. So when you do something, a methodology for rating, you are supposed to maintain it for some years. And if you change your methodology, you have to ask the regulators and give a reason why you change it. I already mentioned it, but scoring is different from rating. Scoring is just using numbers. In rating, you can use numbers, and the rating agencies are using numbers, and will do that with RISC-RG. But you use also qualitative information, and it's mandatory. You have to do so. This is a kind of constraint we have by the regulation, explaining what is a credit rating. A methodology must be rigorous. It must be subject to validation, and with the procedures of validation. Backtesting is mentioned very often. So it's a framework very interesting, but it's a big constraint for us. So I just mentioned some options for our scenarios. As you understand, we'll have models, global models and connected with country models, and we'll run scenarios and to look at risk. What we've decided right now is to take into account for each country what has been decided by the government, which is quite certain. So there will be no hypothesis of a carbon tax which is not already there, or this kind of things in our scenarios. So it's the kind of methodology used by the IEA for this IEA new policy scenario and the 450 scenarios. We won't use the 450 scenarios. We just use what has been decided for the infrastructure, for the tax system by the country. And compared to what have been said during the seminar, we are not looking for the next 50 years. Our time horizon is mostly 10 years from now. It's much longer than what are doing the credit rating agencies, but it's a short period of time compared to the end of the world that we have been talking about during this week. There will be no end of the world in our analysis. But infrastructure, when you talk with experts, and you are among the experts, it's true that the infrastructure won't change that much in the next 10 years. So we'll take into account what are the projects, what has been already decided, or what is quite certain. And it means that for climate, it will be mostly by qualitative comments or analysis will provide that will take into account either impacts or the resilience issue, because we think it will be very difficult to put it on this time frame. So to finish, what kind of scenarios we are looking, we'll be looking at constraints on different items. There will be an item which would be the oil supply. We'll look at the coal supply. We'll do it on a worldwide basis. For the gas, it will be looked at for different areas because they are not connected and they are very different. And now there is no gas market. And we'll look at national electricity for each country. And for each item, for each energy sources, we'll look at if it's in overcapacity, in equilibrium, in undercapacity, and especially we'll look at the stress. With the idea is, from the risk point of view, what we want to see, especially what will happen with stress. So right now, the scenario choice is to look at one scenario, business as usual. There will be one scenario, oil undercapacity. As I mentioned, is a global oil undercapacity. And we'll look 3 or 4 stress scenarios. The number of scenarios depends a lot about our capacity to compute and to make the models running, and the connection we'll have between the different modules of the system, which is quite complex. For the time being, it's where we are now. I'll come back 2 years from now. It's a forecast in the scenarios. I'll come back here to explain where we are when we are longer, but it's just the beginning. Thank you.